But jazz still has a drummer. Jazz still has whatever other instruments that create harmony, create order. And sure, there are experimental artists who make some very far-out music. I mean, just really crazy stuff that doesn't make sense to your ears at all, right? Kind of like some forms of governance in the way that some people decide to ignore human nature. And it has terrible consequences. And if we look through history, I think that we see the song of human nature falling apart. And there's a disconnect from that reality, that common shared interest that we all have, that we all just want to live and not have violence used against us. Places that violate that, like Nazi Germany under the Gestapo, Cambodia under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, under the death squads of Mao, in the gulags in the Soviet Union, the expansionist regimes and their disastrous consequences on the Middle East from places like the UK and Russia, soon to be the United States. Make no mistake, we are in the graveyard of empires in Afghanistan, making the same mistakes as Russia did. But I hope that I've made my point that I'm going headfirst into this, being completely honest with my audience and being completely honest with myself with the work that I make. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Subversion. I decided to change things up here a little bit and divide the show into two sections. One, I'm going to stay with the traditional format that you have heard in the past 23 episodes, but it's going to be every other week with some kind of independent musician or a cultural figure who I found interesting and just sort of get into the human interest side of the guest and what it is that they do in some sort of creative manner. What I'd like to do is tie this show into my political views, just my, some of my more unpopular opinions to some people, because for a while I was trying to not alienate a specific demographic. I just decided that it would be better to be bold and just come out and be everything that I am. It was just sort of limiting the show in itself. There was a lot of content that I felt could be very interesting and useful to myself and people that might want to listen to me. I just am going to combine the concepts of liberty and music because, as I said in the last episode, if you didn't hear, I'm a libertarian coming out of the closet, I guess. And yeah, you can probably expect to hear a lot about overreach of government power, anti-war stuff. So I know that there are a lot of left-leaning people that probably listen to this. So I hope you'll continue to listen even though you don't agree with me sometimes, because there's probably a lot that we do agree on. And I really would like to hear your feedback if you do or don't agree with the things that you hear in this episode, no matter what ideological inclination you come from. I'm usually pretty good about talking to folks as long as they're pretty respectful. But yeah, I'm like anybody else and can get pretty defensive and a little emotional if you start like assassinating my character over things that are just opinions. And just a lot of things that I say are true. They just make people a little uncomfortable, in my opinion. But I was thinking that I could pretty easily make a rather good bridge between the two subjects and just bring it into a whole picture of the reason why I started this podcast. You can expect to see a lot more musicians even that I'm targeting because of their libertarian views, but I'm not going to specifically preclude anybody who's not that because I am not interested in being in echo chambers. If I were, then I wouldn't live in Minnesota in the United States. Specifically, I live in the Twin Cities area, so I'm pretty close to a lot of people that really don't agree with me much on politics, but there are a lot of really wonderful people here, and I just like it despite what negative consequences there are from the politics here. I just think that there's sort of this organic quality to the political philosophy that I have, which stems from this idea of innate human rights to not have aggression used against you, not have violence used against you. That is what I call a negative right. That's a right to not have violence used against you. So a huge reason why I was attracted to this political philosophy was because I was a very peaceful person. I was a progressive and sort of left-leaning person. I was even starting to read books from a philosopher called Peter Kropotkin, I think is how you pronounce it. Kropotkin. Anyway, I started reading him and a little bit of, the origins of socialism and communism because I just thought that that was what I had to push against. I was raised, coming of age in a time when I was understanding the world when George Bush was in the White House, and it was really controversial going into Iraq and Afghanistan and just that whole plan of invading the Middle East. Or at least invading it a little better than Dad did, you know what I mean? And I was just convinced that the worst people in the world were Republicans, that leftism was the way that I needed to go in order to be part of a change that we needed to see in the world. But I quickly discovered that the left and the right in the political elite are really no different. They both use too much violence and make all kinds of excuses for it that aren't legitimate. They violate those natural rights. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how does that tie into music? Well, I think that there is also an organic way that we discovered music. We discovered that there was a pattern to it, that there were these languid things that just made sense to us, right? There's something that compels you to move, something that compels you to speak, to dance when you listen to music, right? Makes you feel deep down inside. I remember some of the earlier days when I was a teenager, some of the music that I just loved with such a passion. I'd listen to an album. It'd be like the 50th time I've heard something. I remember I was a huge Metallica fan and Justice for All. Every time I listen to that album and it gets to one, still to this day, sometimes I get goosebumps and get like the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And the parallels I'm drawing here is that these ideas are so compelling to me that they really changed my life, much like music did. And they come from an organic place all the same, a place of love and wanting to experience. Because that's really, when it comes down to it, I think that a lot of people are driven by that. A lot of people that believe in things that are very bad, in my opinion, that have very terrible consequences, like the drug war, for example. And the way that I see it, we will only be destined to failure if we ignore this sort of organic nature of human life and the way that we interact with each other. Much like in music, if you disrupt the structure in music, you can do some very beautiful things, right? You can create jazz. Jazz is direct opposition. That is the rebel music. And that's fine. I love jazz, right? But jazz still works. Jazz isn't perfect, though, is it? Jazz is far from perfect. It's, in fact, you could say that it is perfected by its imperfection, which is sort of this paradoxical, lovely thing about it. It's very poetic, the whole aspect of the culture and the nature of jazz. But jazz still has a drummer. Jazz still has whatever other instruments that create harmony, create order. And sure, there are experimental artists who make some very, far out music. Just like really crazy stuff that doesn't make sense to your ears at all, right? Kind of like some forms of governance in the way that some people decide to ignore human nature. And it has terrible consequences. And if we look through history, I think that we see the song of human nature falling apart. When there's a disconnect from that reality, that common shared interest that we all have, that we all just want to live and not have violence used against us. Places that violate that, like Nazi Germany under the Gestapo, Cambodia under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, under the death squads of Nazi Germany, or under the death squads of Mao, in the gulags in the Soviet Union. the isolation of Ireland and the potato famine, the expansionist regimes and their disastrous consequences on the Middle East from places like the UK, Australia, and Russia, soon to be the United States. Make no mistake, we are in the graveyard of empires in Afghanistan, making the same mistakes as Russia did. And I will save that for another day, but I hope that I've made my point that I'm going headfirst into this, being completely honest with my audience and being completely honest with myself with the work that I make. I also just wanted to let you guys know that I am aware that the audio is really terrible, and I hope by next episode that I record will be a little bit better. Today I wanted to talk about a story that you've all probably seen by now, and it involves a detective named Jeff Payne, and he is investigating an accident that left one man dead and one man injured. This conflict is between him and Alex Wubbles. She is a nurse at the University of Utah Hospital. What she was doing was refusing to take a blood sample. Before I go any further, I'd like to give just some other details about the origin of the crash. A man was killed when he was in a high-speed chase and hit this man's vehicle, and this man is badly burned. They actually sedated him, and he's in comatose right now. So he is the victim of a really terrible accident that sounds like he wasn't really guilty for, but what we're going on right now is very sparse details, but all we know is that the suspect being pursued is dead, and this is the person that is just in the hospital whose blood is being conflicted over. Now, essentially, she was refusing because her supervisor in the hospital policy is that if someone cannot consent to have their blood drawn, then you can't take it from them without a warrant. The detective didn't have a warrant, but he wanted to just have her get the blood anyway. And he's heard during the encounter saying things like, well, I've never had to take it this far. And when asked about a warrant, he says that they don't have PC, which is cop lingo for probable cause. So they don't actually have any reason to suspect that he had drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of the accident. So they wanted to just get his blood and just test it. And here's the thing is he tries to defend himself by saying he's just trying to get it to keep him safe. Now, if any of you have been in situations with police before, at some point I would like to get into my origin story and tell you why I know so much about this particular phenomenon. I will save that for another episode. Today I'd like to stay focused on this. I can tell you that they lie, and they are encouraged to lie to get what they need, including evidence, especially evidence. The biggest piece of evidence that you could give them is confessing, and they have very good tactics to get you to confess, sometimes even falsely. Your mind just, admits to it just because you think, oh, they're going to do me a solid and they've got this evidence and then I might as well just take their deal. But it's always just to gather evidence. So this is that sort of situation happening, but with a person who's unconscious. So this man who knows what kind of condition he's in, I can't find out from just the open source information that I have here, but it seems like he's in pretty bad shape if he's not able to consent, obviously. Eventually this escalates, and his supervisor, the detective's supervisor, he had to arrest her if she didn't comply, and her supervisor was saying, no, you can't do that. This is against hospital policy. So this was an argument between the liability of the hospital and the will of force of a police department that just wanted, by any means necessary, to get this man's blood. There's no telling, at this point at least, from what we know, what the circumstances leading up to this accident was. All we know are very thin details about the crash. So we don't actually know who's at fault here at all. But that is besides the point. The point is, what this altercation ended up coming to was Nurse Wubbles getting very violently arrested. He drags her out, kind of handles her pretty brutally. And I really think that he's in the wrong here. Now, there are some statutes that I'm going to kind of bring up here. So there is a concept that people are invoking in order to defend the officer and police department in question, and that is implied consent. That is, if a person does not submit to a drug and or alcohol test, that their license can be revoked and they can be fined, and they'll just probably end up getting the test results anyway in some sort of fashion. But if you will remember, just a few minutes ago, I said that he even said that he didn't have probable cause, which is the limitation to what he's supposed to do. And also in the conversation, he says that he's never really had it get to this point where they actually invoked the law in question and the statutes. There are specific vague laws in Utah that basically say that they don't have to consent to take your blood. But here is just from the base philosophical point of view that I have on politics. This comes down to something very fundamental, which is your right to property. And the most essential piece of property that you have is your body. So this man had no way to defend his rights to his property, whether or not he had a choice to consent to the consequences. Who knows what would have happened? He's unconscious. We don't know. But the fact of the matter is that there are certain protocols that we have to abide by, if only a sort of shadow of a right to a choice in that situation. But it is to protect people in these sort of situations when the nurse and the medical professionals don't want to put this person under any more stress, not even the slightest bit of stress, when they are terribly burned all over their body. It's very hard to get a blood sample in that sort of state, I'm sure. I'm not a doctor. I don't know about these things. And just to reiterate, I am just sort of reading open source material here. I don't have anything special to give you. This is just my take. But anyway, this officer treats this nurse like she's just this inconvenience for actually invoking the law, which, okay, I was starting to get to the fact that there are statutes that say you don't have to have consent in Utah. However, there was a Supreme Court case. So this Supreme Court case ruled that blood tests are significantly more intrusive and do not justify violating the Fourth Amendment protections and unreasonable searches. So basically, they rule it as something just too invasive to just arbitrarily avoid abiding by the Fourth Amendment. And so yeah, there is a precedent for this in a higher court, and I just don't necessarily agree with the practices of Utah if that is the manner in which they're going to govern. That is a direct violation of individual liberty and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. If we are to pretend that we are a constitutional republic, we have to actually abide by those amendments. They aren't just for us to ignore when it's inconvenient and for us to shield officers from any sort of accountability for violating these things by some sort of arbitrary statutory law. Other than that, it's just this systematic problem, I think, with having a direct monopoly on this kind of violence. Technically, all of us, according to statistics, violate 3 felonies a day. And I know that's like probably playing with statistics for a little bit, but that's just kind of the average. This is the sign of a sort of police state where it's pretty obvious that in pockets of law enforcement throughout the country, there is a rather lawless approach to law enforcement. This is a very big problem, in my opinion, which that sort of gets into why I favor the political system, which I do, which is one built on very strict property rights, and especially property rights to one's own body. That's my take on it. I might wait until tomorrow morning. I'm recording this on Friday, sort of the day that I started reading about all this, and there are all these new developments. So we'll see what happens. And I saw before I started recording that a prosecutor in Utah is seeking a criminal investigation into this whole thing. So it looks like a discovery process will be starting from some other agency. I guess we'll see what happens and see how they respond to it. Hopefully a lot better than any of the other places in the country. And I feel like that's just going to, depending on how they handle it, could be a big deal, in my opinion. But anyway, I will take a look and won't release it until tomorrow, just waiting to see what develops and if there's anything interesting to add on top of that.
I'd like to note more on the actual high-speed chase. Now, I am of the belief that these high-speed chases should not happen as often as they do in America. I feel like the risk involved in pursuing a high-speed chase often outweigh the benefit of criminal justice that would come of it, because a lot of these people that are running probably are running from some sort of small crime, and I'm not saying that's all the time. There are a lot of times when high-speed chases are because of a dangerous suspect. I just would like to see a higher threshold for when we initiate these kinds of high-speed chases. Of course, we don't have any more details other than what we have here, but one of them is that, the suspect running, I couldn't quite find his name, but the name of the semi-truck driver, his name is William Gray of Rigby, Idaho. And he's actually a reserve police officer with the Rigby Police Department. So in my mind, I can't help but think that perhaps the Detective Jeff Payne, has some sort of motive here because the victim of this crash is a police officer. Now, I don't know exactly, this is all speculation, but I'm curious if the fact that if they obtain a blood sample during the investigation here, if that will help clear the off-duty police officer's name in the court process or some sort of appeals process for benefits or a settlement, something like that. Now, I was talking to one guy who was a little skeptical of that. It's just one of the pieces of speculation that I have out there, and I just can't think of anything else besides that, or if the detective is just trying to get an arrest. The job of a detective is to get arrests. It's not to, make it easier for anyone. They're there to discover evidence, to get convictions. That's what they do. So if he's not protecting his, brother in blue, as it were, then he's probably looking for a conviction of some kind, put some blame on somebody. Again, this is all just speculation. I suppose we'll hear more or not about this. As we know, some of these things are just a flash in the pan, and you hear all this stuff about them one day, and then, it gets put on page 12A 5 months from now, and no one even knows what the hell they're talking about anymore. So the attention span of the public at large and the collective will of the media may not be there for very long. But yeah, I guess we'll see what happens. And just some closing thoughts here on the developments in this story. I did watch the press conference with Mayor Jackie Biskupski, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Chief of Police Mike Brown. Now, they did seem to be genuinely concerned about this, and one has to think that if this police footage was released, that they were anticipating these kinds of backlashes, because in the world that we live in today, these things go viral, and people like me are out there talking about it, talking smack on the cops. Which, to Salt Lake City's credit, they have been given some notoriety recently, given that they haven't actually had a police-involved shooting since 2015. So they obviously have some inclinations to do something about criminal justice reform
and having good relationships with the public. So, of course, like most press conferences after controversial things like this, there was a lot of sort of empty platitudes about, this is an ongoing investigation and we can't really release such and such details, blah, blah, blah. And, I think they did actually handle it very well as far as things go, and they do seem to genuinely care about this sort of situation. And the police chief, Mike Brown, went on this pithy little speech about how the nurses are the people that the police go to in the event of injury in the line of duty, so they want to have a good relationship with them. Kind of makes sense, right? So yeah, it looks like they're going to handle this pretty well. But again, I just want to stress that the root of this conflict and the fact that this detective felt he was above the law, just wanted to get what he wanted, and was emboldened by his supervisor, this is a symptom of a larger problem. And one has to wonder, despite Salt Lake City's ongoing efforts to curb the police violence, that it is still very much a thing within their departments. Whether this is an isolated incident or not is not very important. The fact is that it happened, this video went viral, and they are going to have to answer for that. And that will wrap it up for today. Just FYI, this segment of the show is going to be sort of a variety show. Sometimes I will give my take on something that's going on in the news, something topical such as anti-war stuff, and interviews with people who I feel are authorities on things that I may not know quite as much about. So stay tuned and bear with me here as we sort of discover the place that this podcast is going to fall after this pivot into a new sort of genre and direction here. I really do hope you like it, though, so if you would please subscribe on your way out today on your podcatcher of choice. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, and I plan to get on some more platforms. If you have any requests, please let me know. You can also find the show at subversionwebcast.com, easily shareable buttons there on each blog post, and you can also find me direct at facebook.com/subversionwebcast. Follow me on Twitter as well. My handle is intaxicated with an 8 in it. If you have trouble finding me, just search for Trey Dude, and I should come up on that handle there. Anyway, I will see you next time, and until then, please take care of yourself, and I will see you then.